Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon from Washington, D.C. Good morning to those of you who are west of us, and good evening to those of you who are east of us. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's really great to be here with all of you. Before we dive in, there's a small exercise we wanted to do to start out with, and it's called a gratitude choir. The idea is that you take a moment to think of one thing that you're grateful for, and then Jenna, who is managing our chat and this webinar, will unmute everyone, and on the count of 3, we will all say that thing we are grateful for all together as a chorus and just create a moment of presence and gratitude. So take a quick moment to think of something that you are grateful for, and then we'll try it out. Ready? All right, Jenna, can you unmute everyone, please? All right. 1, 2, 3. Time
Health and
personal connection.
I only heard a couple of people, so I'm actually going to try that one more time. Just everybody speak up all at the same time on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3.
Health and kids.
Connection.
Much better. Fabulous. Thank you so much. All right. My name is Niranjali Amarasinghe, and I am the Executive Director of ActionAid USA. Before getting to the formal portion of this webinar, I do want to flag that this webinar is being recorded and it will be shared publicly afterward. There's also a Google document that will drop into the chat shortly, where you can follow along. There are some resources in there and you can follow along with the webinar and pinpoint exactly where we are at. And there I see the link. Excellent. If you have trouble accessing it, please let us know via the chat box. So to say a little bit about ActionAid, we are an international network building a just, equitable, and sustainable world in solidarity with communities on the front lines of poverty and injustice. We work in more than 50 countries to achieve social justice, gender equality, and poverty eradication. And our theory of change is to shift power away from elites and toward frontline communities. This particular webinar is one of a series that we are launching. And in this webinar, we are going to explore the connections between the fight against land grabs and community struggles for racial justice and freedom from state violence across the Americas. We've got a great lineup of fearless campaigners in Brazil, Guatemala, and the US, and we'll make some time later to collectively explore actions that we can take. In terms of why this webinar and why now, in our work, one of the things that we have highlighted is the fact that communities of color, indigenous communities, and rural communities have long experienced power imbalances and inequalities. And in the light of this pandemic, we are seeing that these inequalities are significantly exacerbated. And communities who have already been facing inequalities are facing even deeper inequalities now. Couple that with the heightened awareness around racial injustice stemming from the protests around George Floyd's death and murder, we have seen an opening of space and conversation and connecting issues in a way that we haven't seen before. There have been conversations people are having about what kind of new social contract we have and how do we make sure that government works for all people, including communities of color, indigenous communities, and rural communities. So we wanted to make a little bit of space to talk about the work that ActionAid has been doing in promoting land rights in the context of COVID, and also make connections to racial injustice and the fight to try to address these inequalities that we're seeing across racial lines. In terms of the setup for this webinar, I'll just introduce the sort of roadmap so you can follow along. We'll start off with our 3 speakers who will make brief presentations, and there'll be a little bit of conversation about what they talk about. And then we will open up the space for questions from those of you who are attending. What I would ask is that you hold your questions while the speakers are presenting. And when I open up and say, please post your questions in the Zoom chat, do so then. And I will select a few questions for you to come online and ask the question in person. And we'll have a conversation on that basis. After that, we will have a short section of collective reflection and what we call an exercise in 15% solutions, which I will explain when we get there. And if there is time, we'll have a similar moment of opening up for you all to pose questions or comments in the chat and give you a space to speak if there's time left over. And with that, let's dive in. So we've got 3 speakers today with us. Laura Hurtado, who is the Executive Director of ActionAid Guatemala, Emmanuel Ponch, a campaigner at ActionAid Brazil, and our very own Tristan Quinn Thibodeau, biofuels, land rights, and food security campaigner at ActionAid USA. We're going to start with Laura. Laura has been the Executive Director of ActionAid Guatemala since 2014. She has a long history of working with displaced communities and on agrarian conflicts and rural development issues. And I'm going to turn it over to her now.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm glad to share with my colleagues and with all of you this afternoon. So I'm going to talk to you about land grabbing and shrinking political space in Guatemala. In Guatemala, the land has been a source of social conflicts throughout the country's history. The land is the cornerstone of the Guatemalan social building. Because on it has been forged the wealth and opulence of a very few and the misery and abandonment of the vast majority. The history of Guatemala is the history of the striving of the Maya indigenous peoples of the land, which is its source of sustainment, identity, routine, and culture. Contrary to what many people think, private ownership of land is not given as natural. It has not existed forever. That is why we say that private property over land is a social construct. Throughout history, what we know as private property on land has been built. And throughout the history of our country, there have been precise moments of private appropriation of land. During the colonial times and the liberal reform at the end of the 19th century when the land registry was created. What we are witnessing today is a new cycle of appropriation of land that started around 2002. After the signing of the peace accords back in 1996, the state was committed to give titles of 200 of peasants and indigenous communities, to recognize the rights of their possessions, and some of the communities got their land, their ownership titles, but in other cases, the titles never came. So right now you can see in the screen the map of Guatemala, and what you see shadowed with light blue is the areas where the ownership titles were supposed to be handed out by the government after the peace accords were signed down. And the shadow in red is the area identified by the Ministry of Agriculture as the area suitable for the plantation of oil palm. So you can see immediately that there was a potential conflict stated there. Today, what we are seeing is the advance of the farms, the expansion of plantations and monocultures, and very huge investment projects parallel to the eviction of communities, leaving thousands and thousands of families in extreme poverty, torn out from their mother nature. Eviction, violence, and misery where there were vestiges of indigenous settlements, where their ceremonial centers are located, where their living memory that recognizes these possessions as their land, and on which the last generations have lived over the years. And what can you go on with the next slide, please? So what's going on during the pandemic? Here I am presenting to you two photographs where ActionAid and the social organization we work with were distributing basic food to communities, to local indigenous communities. And the communities were reacting in a very organized way, adopting the sanitary measures that were also disseminated by radio spots in their indigenous languages. And the next, please. And here there is the arrival of the military that the president set up a prevention state in order to take control of the territory and permit evictions and support the landlords. So what the communities are asking for is just to keep their livelihoods, to be respected as indigenous people and be able to live with dignity and peace. Along with them, we argue that the state must be the guarantor of the human rights, women's rights, and the rights of indigenous peoples. The Guatemalan state is called upon to investigate in depth the history of the occupation of these lands and protect the weakest, securing livelihoods for indigenous communities. Yet, what we are seeing currently is that the state and the power, through what we call the Pact of Corrupts, which is the ruling alliance between the oligarchy, the military, the old political class, and the dark forces linked to crime and illegal businesses, they are supporting evictions and criminalizing those who demand their rights. The prevention state that was stated by the president and has been ratified in the past days, it only entails fear, terror, forced displacement, and suffering for the people and the communities, the indigenous communities which we work with. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. We'll move now to Emmanuel. Emmanuel's campaign work with ActionAid Brazil focuses on food sovereignty, climate justice, participatory democracy, and the rights of traditional peoples and communities. Thank you for joining us from Brazil. Please share with us what your experiences have been.
Thank you, Naranjali, and thank you, Laura, as well, for this presentation. I think it's great that Laura came before me, because I think a lot of the history of Guatemala is very close to Brazil. Land issue with Brazil has this beginning all the way, it goes back all the way to colonization. So since when Portuguese started colonizing Brazil, and the empire divided the country into big stripes of land and handed them over to a few of what we could call the friends of the empire. And you know the story. In the script I've prepared, I thought I'd give a bit of a background from the Brazilian colonization, but as I saw, a lot of the people from the chat presented themselves were already in touch with a lot of the land rights movement, so I don't want to get into much of the detail there. But the point I want to make here is just to say that the land issue goes all the way back, and since then we have this big relationship between landowners and the power structures, and this is something that we see 500 years afterwards into this day. And we had this genocide of indigenous peoples, and then we also had the the African slavery waves in Brazil. And so this historical process throughout the centuries brought the situation that we have now. So a number of indigenous peoples thrive despite of all the violence of colonizations, and some identities were started off from there. We have what we call quilombolas, which are formed by former runaway enslaved African people and other peasant groups that build their lives according to their ancestors' culture and their beliefs and the kind of landscape they live in. So these are the groups that might sound a bit different for foreigners, but we call them traditional peoples and communities. So if Jenna can start the slide, please. Thank you. So this is a group of Babasu coconut breakers, as we call them. They are a group of what we call traditional peoples and communities, and we have a big range of identities like them. We have fishermen, river dwellers, collectors of natural resources, flower picking communities, and then indigenous peoples and quilombolas are also part of these traditional peoples and communities. And as I mentioned, these are communities that have lived in their territories for centuries. They have a deep knowledge of their landscapes, of the nature, of the use of medicinal herbs, of local fruits. They know very much about the climate cycles that they live in and so on. So they have their own community folklores connected to their territories, and they have their ancestors buried there in their territories. And these identities are also recognized internationally by Convention 169, which is the Convention on Indigenous and Tribal Peoples, and also the Convention on Biodiversity. So at the same time, we have that dimension. We have the dimension of the rural occupation that went on in Brazil throughout the land grabbing. And in a very broad sense, what I can say, so I don't get into much detail because these lands issues are very complicated. The traditional peoples and communities, they are allowed to live in public lands, but for them to have tenure security, they need to go through a specific process that goes through anthropological studies, demarcation of their land, and at the end, a sign-off from the government, which can take quite long. And the process of land grabbing from big landowners that have resources, relationship with power structures, and even they're connected with international investors, they can grab the land much quicker than communities can actually prove that they are what we call traditional communities and have their tenure security. So the process of the land grabbing and the commodization of Brazil has a different range of impacts in those communities, either by grabbing their land, which is the most obvious one, but also by surrounding communities with a highly damaging kind of agricultural production that uses plenty of pesticides, GMO seeds, pollutes rivers and dries them up, destroy the natural landscape, promotes the killing of local animals and insects, and also contaminates communities' crops. So in general, what communities want is mainly, just like Laura mentioned, just to live with dignity and have their right to adequate food and livelihoods being met. So our work in ActionAid is pretty much supporting those traditional communities and peasant groups to strengthen their tenure rights, organizing family farming or agroecological cooperatives, supporting them to access public policies, such as a few that we have. We have public procurement programs. So there are a few programs that are enforced by law demanding that at least 30% of the food provided for schools and other public institutions, such as hospitals, subsidized restaurants that we call something that would be translated as restaurants of the people, food banks, and other kinds of services. So we provide technical advisory for them to promote their access to those policies. As ActionAid, we've been in the core coalition in the process of approving those laws, such as the one I just mentioned, which is the National National School Meals Program and the National Acquisition Program. This was a couple of years ago. It was in the first years of ActionAid. And more recently, we've been working on the national campaign in defense of the Sejado. And the Sejado, for those who don't know, is an ecosystem, a biome in Brazil that you can see in the picture that it's on the slide. The Sejado is the orange center part. So you can see the Amazon above. The Sejado is the second biggest biome in Brazil, and it's a lot of the traditional peoples and communities that we are talking about also lives, and it's considered a place. It's considered the cradle of waters in Brazil because it's where most of our water basins come from. It's considered also the most biodiverse savanna in the world. So the lack of protection of the biome also puts the communities in a vulnerable position. Internationally, we've been bringing family farmers and traditional communities to meet decision makers. So one example was maybe something that Tristan might bring out in his presentation. We went to the US and brought a family farmer, a land activist, to speak with clients of pension funds that invest in land in Brazil. And we also called the World Bank's attention to one of their projects in the Brazilian state of Piauí, where land regularization process with funds from the World Bank has been used to regularize land grabs. This picture is a very nice picture of the landscape in the Sejado. You can see the chapadas or the plateaus behind and the lowlands. And the last picture is us handing over a petition of the Sejado campaign asking the Congress people in Brazil to approve a constitutional amendment that transforms the Sejado into a national heritage site, which is a status that the Amazon, the rainforest, and the Pantanal in Brazil already hold. So we want to raise the Sejado to that level too. So yeah, I think my time for the initial presentation is finishing. So I'll raise specific issues on the pandemic situation regarding those communities while we go on with our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Emmanuel. It really struck me that in both the presentations that we've heard, something that's coming across really strongly is the coercive power of the state and how environmental racism plays out over centuries, with shifting power across state, whether it's military presence or unnecessary bureaucracy or surrounding communities with harmful practices that essentially drive them out of their lands or make their lands unusable for them. We'll move now to Tristan to talk about efforts in the US and context in the US. So Tristan works with grassroots organizations and allies through national networks and coalitions to build support for land, food, energy, and climate policies that work for communities and families. Over to you, Tristan.
Thank you, Naranjali, and thank you to Laura and Emmanuel for your presentations and for everyone for joining this webinar. It's really great to be here. So I'm Tristan Quintibido, and I am the campaigner at ActionAid USA. And I think I should start off by just maybe explaining how campaigns are structured a little bit at ActionAid USA and the kind of role we play within the broader ActionAid International Federation. I think ActionAid USA has, in large part, um, amplified the voices of and created space for communities from the global south and our ActionAid partners in other countries that they work with to intervene in U.S. policy spaces and also in international policymaking spaces, especially ones that are based in the United States, such as the UN in New York or the World Bank in Washington, D.C. And that's been a role that we've played for the 2 decades that we've been an organization here in the U.S. And I think and also to say, we've focused primarily on rural issues at ActionAid USA and focused on the human rights of rural communities. And I think we've tried to look at how the issues intersect with how many different issues intersect. So looking at the right to land, which we've talked, this is primarily what this webinar is about, is how important the human right to land is, but also the human right to food, which is connected, and also, the right to a livable climate, to climate justice. And I think I just want to say that more recently, however, we've begun to work more strongly, more closely with grassroots organizations in the U.S., with rural communities in the U.S. who are facing the same problems that communities in Brazil and Guatemala are facing. And now I'll just start by saying talk about some of the U.S. policies and some of the international policies that kind of come out of the U.S., which are impacting communities in the global south that we've focused on recently. One that we've done the most work on is U.S. biofuels or agrofuels policies, promoting large-scale monocultures of crops like corn, soybeans, sugarcane to be produced as fuels for cars, without really any protections for farmers or for rural communities. And these policies have driven demand for agricultural product, and that demand has exacerbated existing land conflicts and human rights violations in countries like Brazil and Guatemala, as well as the sort of precarious situation that family farmers and workers find themselves in the United States. And we've also focused on something more recent since the financial crisis, which is the trend of financial companies and investors to see farmland as a financial asset and to go out and try to acquire farmland in other countries as well as in the United States. Brazil is a major target. The Sejado region is a major target for these financial investors. And as they buy farmland, they do business with land grabbers, they do business with deforesters, and they, create, they facilitate and contribute to the problems that Emmanuel mentioned. I think I also just want to say quickly, yeah, we also work, Emmanuel mentioned the World Bank and how the World Bank in many communities in the global south, there's been strong efforts to try to get the right to land protected. And one way that communities do that is by getting community land rights. So it's not just, you individual have a title to this land. The whole community controls the land, has a title to the land, and they can decide who gets to use it. And it's based on community decisions and community, governance. But something that the World Bank has done, I think did in Guatemala and is doing now in Piauí state in Brazil, and something we've tried to speak out strongly against, is to privatize all these community land titles, which they do, saying that this is going to guarantee more land tenure, but unfortunately it undermines land tenure and land security. So that's something that we also are very focused on. And regarding the situation in Guatemala, we're also very concerned about the human rights policies of the US government and how they enable or allow the situation in Guatemala to continue, this bad situation, as well as the migration policies in the United States, which are exploitative or abusive of migrants coming to this country who are trying to escape a bad situation, which was perhaps created by the, or not created by, but certainly not helped by the policies, the human rights policies of the U.S. government regarding situation in Guatemala and elsewhere. But as I mentioned, we're also focusing more on communities in the U.S. And I just want to say that, you know, in the United States, I think with the issue of land, there's this maybe mythologized history that everybody had access to land, you know, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, that there's this family farming tradition or a yeoman farming tradition going back to Thomas Jefferson or something. And, you know, that may be the case for certain groups of people, but the history of agriculture and of land ownership in the United States is also the history of slavery and plantation agriculture, which in some ways has not changed much in this country. And instead of, obviously, there's slavery was abolished, but there are still cases of forced labor in agriculture, and the situation of migrant farm workers is somewhat similar in many ways. Migrant farm workers do not have rights and do not have any way to access land of their own. So, and on top of that, there's been a long history of discrimination against African American, Latinx farmers, Asian farmers as well as women farmers. And these are issues which we are trying to give more visibility to, especially as I mentioned, some trends like the increasing what we call the financialization of farmland. If these large financial companies seek to acquire land, sort of exacerbate or take advantage of these trends. And the other big piece of it is that family farmers are, the family farming tradition that does exist is in danger. The average age of a farmer is approaching 60 years old, a farmer with land, and they will be retiring and selling that land or having to transition that land. And there's a concern that if you know, the only people who will be able to afford it will be the deep-pocketed investors. So this is a major concern for us as we think about who's going to control the land, who's going to control food production. And because we also have this model of agriculture, this industrial, chemical, monocrop model, which by all accounts is making climate change worse and is very vulnerable and in danger of climate change, of the extreme weather and the unpredictability that climate change is creating or unleashing. So we need to be transitioning to an ecological model, to agroecology. Emmanuel mentioned agroecology earlier. But if the people controlling the land are financial institutions who have who don't have a connection to the land, who don't have an intimate knowledge of the ecosystem or the community, who are just interested in their rate of financial return, I personally don't know how we make that transition. So these are some of the issues we're focusing on. Still looking at how US policies and international spaces based in the US are impacting countries and communities abroad, but also how communities in the US are facing the same situations as communities in the global South. And yeah, I can talk more about that in the question and answer session.
Thank you so much, Tristan. I wanted to pick up on this thread around privatization and the power of elites, particularly in the context of COVID and COVID recovery. Certainly in the US, one of the things we've seen in the packages around COVID recovery or emergency response stimulus and the like has been a heavy emphasis toward supporting big companies and keeping them afloat in this time of crisis, with the expectation that keeping them afloat will somehow allow for the economy to recover. And that is happening at the expense of everyday people, family farmers and low-income community members who desperately need resources and support right now that the government is not providing, save for a one-off injection earlier on this year. So I wanted to ask all of you, and perhaps we can start with you, Laura, in your context and how the government is responding to COVID, what are you seeing as some of the most pressing issues that marginalized communities are facing? And are you also seeing this trend even in the face of a crisis that is hitting communities that we work with so much harder, still a sort of an emphasis for the private sector and supporting companies at the expense of communities?
Yes, in the context of COVID, the government has put in place 10 programs, and he got some land fund, some funds from the World Bank and the DIB, but they are not arriving to the communities. The population that is the communities that are really needing these funds are not getting it all the time, because the state has no way of getting to the more vulnerable sectors. So this is one problem. They are giving some funding aid through the electrical bill, but communities in the rural areas have no electricity. So how can you reach them? This is one problem. But on the other side, there are policies that are supporting very big producers in order to recover and be able to continue exporting products. But there are not yet policies that support the small producers. So when you see that to face the pandemics, the small producers are the main ones that are producing food for all of us. We have all what we need in the cities and the towns. But this is being produced by peasants. The state should have a specific program, some specific programs to support small producers. So the state is not supporting the small producers, and he is backing the landowners and those who pretend to grab more land on their side. So this is making more vulnerable the communities in the countryside. And there is this criminalization going on for all those who are demanding their rights. We have seen over the past days kidnaps, a community leader that just disappeared, forced disappearance, which we saw during the armed conflict in the past, and murder of human rights defenders. Even one INGO, French colleague of all of us as INGO officer. So it is really we have a very deep concern on the human rights and the shrinking of all civil and political space for Guatemalans and the persons that are cooperating with our development issue.
Thank you, Laura. Yeah, it's a tough situation, and our hearts are with you and all the other activists on the ground in Guatemala at the moment. Emmanuel, can you tell us a bit more about how the context of COVID and COVID recovery is affecting the communities that you're working with in Brazil?
Sure. Yeah, the pandemic has been hitting those communities very hard. I can say a number of reasons. First, because they live far from urban centers where most of the hospitals and other health services are present. Also because most of their income comes from food production, and with the isolation procedures, they've lost their markets that are traditionally through open fairs. So without being able to sell their products, they had to start stocking perishable food, but since it doesn't last long, they end up losing their crops. And I think probably one of the most difficult parts is that land conflicts are not in quarantine. So in fact, it's quite the opposite. The government is actually using the focus in COVID, in the health issues and the pandemic, to pass a number of measures that weakens environmental protection and social protection without media attention. So a few of them were, the government gave amnesty to the foresters. They also gave authorization to occupy indigenous lands that are still in process of regularization. The government has been weakening the supervisory bodies of the Ministry of the Environment. And this happened either by substituting technical experts or drastically reducing the budgets and the responsibilities of those bodies. We actually had a presidential, I don't know the exact translation of the measure itself, but in a free translation, it would be the presidential provisory measure to regularize land grabs. And what I think is really taking a lot of international media attention is just the exponential increase of deforestation rates that is going on right now. In terms of the response itself, I would say we have a few positive things that the civil society fought for and that we were able to pass through the Congress, and even with a lot of, it was a kind of a fist fight with the government to have those measures approved, but we did get an emergency basic income that was approved. That was for 6,000 reais initially for 3 months, but now it's being postponed until we are not sure when. We are as civil society, we're asking for it to be postponed at least until the end of the year, or until the effects of the pandemic continues. But 600 reais is about now $100 and something, and that can be a double this amount for families that are headed by women, and this is allowing actually half of the population, the Brazilian population. It's like 100 million people having the basic dignity being attended throughout the pandemic. And we had many complaints about the access of those policies because at first it was through an app, and then we had a lot of bureaucratic difficulties. In Brazil, we also had what you mentioned, a few of the measures of the what we call the bailing out measures as well. And some of them are still being discussed. But we did get some of the benefits for civil society, although we cannot say it was very well put together when in practice. But one of the things that we've been fighting for as well, as I mentioned before, the public procurement policy that asks for 30% share of family farming. With COVID, we had a lot of pressure from supermarkets, lobbying, and politicians to not have that 30% share, because if schools were closed, then families wouldn't, kids wouldn't be getting the school feeding in schools. So they were advocating to transform the school feeding budget into cards that would be handed over to families so they could buy the food. But this would mostly benefit big supermarkets and the agribusiness that access the supermarket as a place to sell their products, and puts communities in a more vulnerable situation. So we've been advocating to keep the purchase and to make available the school feeding as food baskets to be delivered directly to people. And this has been a very decentralized initiative, because we have the federal government, but we also have state and municipality responsibilities regarding school feeding. So we've been trying to advocate that into all of these different levels.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Very worrying to hear about the weakening of environmental and social protections, but it also sounds like there are some things in the civil society world that at least have been getting a little bit of traction. So there have been some damaging impacts that are being stemmed a little bit because of the efforts of civil society, and that's good to hear. Tristan, I'm gonna go over to you and just want to reinforce what Jenna put in the chat. Feel free to start typing questions now while Tristan handles this last question, and then I will open it up to folks to post their questions. So Tristan, if you could reflect a bit, building on what Laura and Emmanuel have shared about how the context of COVID is affecting the land rights situation within the US, and especially how it's impacting family farmers. Thank you.
Sure, yeah, I think for folks in the US, you know, the media coverage of the last several months has there have been many stories about how the pandemic has impacted farmers and workers. For farmers who sell to restaurants, it's obviously been devastating. They have no place to sell their crops and have had to, plow it under, which would at least improve their soil, but it's a total loss. And then for workers, it's been even more of a disaster for meat packing workers or farm workers. There's been strikes, a number of strikes in Washington state because growers were not providing workers with enough PPE, the protection equipment, I forget the full acronym, personal protective equipment. And meat packers have, I think in Missouri, started a lawsuit against Smithfield or Tyson, I think Smithfield, for how unresponsive and unhelpful they were to workers' safety. So those have been pretty well publicized in the media. I would just say, what we've seen is that these investors are seeing agriculture and farmland as so much of the economy is in turmoil, both within the United States and globally. There's continue to see, just like 2008 during the financial crisis, this new financial crisis, they continue to see farmland and agriculture and agribusiness as being very good speculative bets and good pieces of the economy to control. And so it's very worrying that they will continue to acquire land. And similarly, when it comes to biofuels, I think certainly the consumption of ethanol has decreased as fewer people are driving and commuting and things like that. But I think as the climate crisis continues to worsen and governments continue to not act, we're likely to see much more attention. We're already kind of seeing more attention being brought back to biofuels, but with these kind of problematic technologies, and I think like carbon capture and storage. And I think this is all kind of being accelerated by COVID. I know we're running out of time and we need to open up for questions, but I did want to, there were a few slides that I did want to just quickly draw viewers' attention to. Is it possible to just throw those up? Because I think this is important to note. This is what's going to happen. So this is a picture of farmland that's acquired in Brazil, acquired by foreign investors, and this is it. It's raised. I think this was vegetation before, and now it's just thousands of acres of soybeans. And then the next slide. This is a field, a cotton field in Mississippi owned by the retirement fund TIAA. This is in the Mississippi Delta, which is a historically black area. I mean, it's 70, 80% black, but the land is all owned by, white landowners, and now like $1 trillion pension fund, and the communities have no access to the land, no control over this land, which in many cases, the families may have been working on this land for hundreds of years. And then the final slide, just to mention this, I did want to mention this in my presentation. This is something Emmanuel had mentioned, and there's myself and Emmanuel, where we did facilitate a visit from Altamaran Ribeiro, who's a land rights defender from Brazil, brought him to the US, and he was able to travel to Mississippi and meet communities and try to build some international solidarity around these land grabs affecting communities of color, and the shared struggle. And I think we're going to need more of that, these kinds of this international solidarity, and also we're going to be seeing more of these land grabs if this crisis continues to play out the way it's been playing out, with all of the attention and resources going to the powerful, the corporations and things like that, and very little going to the communities, to the workers, to the people.
Thank you, Tristan. Apparently you should wear ties more. All right, so I don't see any questions in the chat box. So I'm gonna ask if anyone has a question or comment, can you please raise your hand so that we can give you a chance to speak. I'm just gonna wait just for a little bit. I'm sure there are some questions. All right, well, I'll pose another one, but encouraging all of you to think of a question and ask it, because we will give you the floor to ask the question and come in on the webinar itself. Emmanuel, I wanted to pick up on the connection in Brazil with land grabbing and finance in the US and investment from the US, which is something that both you and Tristan have mentioned. Could you say a little bit more about that, and how investment from US-based companies or pension funds or others is affecting the land rights situation in Brazil?
Yeah, I could try to start answering the question, and maybe Tristan might want to jump in to talk about the specifics of the tracking of investments from TIAA and so. So yeah, as I mentioned before, and I didn't in my initial presentation, I didn't want to get into much of the detail into how land rights and the land issues in Brazil is historically. But what I can say is that we, as I think Laura also mentioned in her first presentation, the history of land in Brazil is very blurry. We don't actually have a clear map of where the private lands and the public lands stand. And we can see that a lot of what used to be public land a few years ago or a few decades ago are now privatized. And when we get to the registry offices, I don't know if that's the accurate translation for what I want to talk about, but these are like offices where people registrate their land, their properties, and it is actually a private institution, but it has a public what we call public faith. It has like a public ownership to say that that land is someone's or not. So we have, throughout this process of registering land, occupying and registering land, we have a huge process of forging land documents and actually trying to turn illegal land grabs into legal properties. And this process, we call it grilagem. It's a term that comes, grilo means cricket, and the name actually comes from these times where people would forge a document by taking a piece of paper, writing like this person is the owner of this X size land, and then they would put it on a drawer with crickets, and the crickets would eat it and poop on it, and then 10 days later, it looks like a 50-year document or a 100-year document. So this has been a process that has been going on since ever in Brazil, since the first land law, which was in the 18 something 18th century, and it happens up until today, but now it's more sophisticated and it has other technological ways of having those kind of process of land grabbing. And what happens is that foreign investors, they usually, what we've been seeing, and we have even a case from Harvard, from the Harvard Endowment Fund, that this was already proved, that they actually bought a land that was grabbed illegally in this grilagem process. And this happens when we have the traction of the international investments, either by, we have Chinese investors, US investors, pension funds. It gives traction and it gives more power to those people that are promoting the land conflicts and forging those land titles and grabbing that land. Yeah, I think I tried to explain that in a very overall manner. Of course, it's much trickier than that. We have very good allies in universities that are doing strong research pieces on this. We can definitely share more if people want to know more. You can get in touch afterwards, but this is just making the long story short.
Thank you. That's I love the history and the context you provided down to the story of the crickets. All right, we have some questions now. Emira, let's unmute Emira. You have a few seconds to ask your question, and I'm going to hand over to Laura to answer the question around women.
No need to mute, but since I've muted, just to thank you all for organizing this session, and I look forward to hearing from Laura on the disproportionate impact of both the COVID and the land grabs in the various contexts. But thank you for the job well done.
Okay, thank you, Amira. Well, the impacts on women, the impact of COVID on women all around the country are very, very high, because they are the ones that are assuming the most of the work inside the house. And in many cases, there has been an increased violence, domestic violence, because of the lockout. But we, as ActionAid Guatemala, we work more in the rural areas. And there the situation is quite different, because the COVID hasn't arrived to these very far away communities. But women mostly suffer from the restrictions of mobilization and transportation. By now, they don't have access to the health services. These were already very, very poor services, very bad services. But while we don't have public transportation, they are they don't have any access at all. So this is one thing. Then children are not going to school, and while the ministry is saying to have online classes and go ahead with the education cycle through other means, through telephone, this is a very poor media to go to get to the rural areas, to get to these faraway communities, very isolated communities. So the impacts on rural peasant communities, indigenous communities, is being very, very, very high. And besides that, what I tried to show you in my presentation is that this political class and what I call the pact of corrupts, the alliance of all these powers, very huge powers, are taking advantage of the lockout, the lack of transportation, no public transportation, etc., to go ahead in their own plans. The Congress, they want to continue passing out some laws to continue with corruption and impunity, and the economic model laws they need to put in. So I think the COVID is here, it's real, but it is impacting in the most poor sectors of the society. And these powerful groups are taking advantage to pass out the regressive laws in all the context. As you can remember, we have been struggling against corruption and impunity over the past years, and this alliance and this pact of corrupts were backed by the U.S. government, and they got rid of the CC, which was the UN Commission Against Corruption and Impunity. So there is they feel backed by this power, and we are still trying to go on with this struggle against impunity and corruption.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lara. There's a question from Robert Thibodeau. Great to see the family supporting, which is what I'm assuming. Robert, we'll unmute you. Go ahead and ask your question. Not hearing Robert. Okay, there might be an issue. So I will go ahead. Oh, go ahead.
Okay. I just wondered if there are also programs that you support that do help out small farmers, somebody wanting to get in farming, somebody who's a farmer that doesn't own land that wants to purchase land. Are there programs that you support for that, and whether the other countries or the US? Is there something going on there that you can support?
Thank you so much. Who'd like to take that question? Tristan, would you like to start?
Sure, yeah, so thank you for the question. It's a great question. And I think, so we at ActionAid USA work with a few different family farming organizations in the United States. And we try to amplify the policy solutions and the programs that they are advocating for and have advocated for a long time. I think, in terms of the question of accessing land, it's a little bit tricky. But one of the ways that family farmers, one of the things that family farmers in the United States have been asking for a long time are fair prices. So just like workers need a fair minimum wage And just like you see a lot of big box stores coming into communities, displacing small businesses because they can pay poverty wages. We also see agribusiness companies being able to pay farmers, pennies on the dollar for their crops. And that creates a situation where farmers have to compete against themselves to get bigger and bigger. There's a saying that was made famous by the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture under Nixon, get big or get out. And that's pretty much been the mantra of agribusiness and this trend in agriculture for the last 50 years. And so one way you reverse that trend and you allow family farmers to stay on the land is to ensure that they get fair pricing. And one way to do that, and it's not consumers paying the price necessarily, it's a lot of times these big companies paying a fair price. So it's Kellogg paying a fair price for the corn that they use to make the cornflakes. The consumers aren't paying anymore. It's the companies that have to pay the farmers more. They have to pay a price that actually is representative of how much work and how much care it takes to produce these crops, to make sure you're producing in a way that's good for the soil, good for the water and things like that. So that's a big piece. There's also, these companies a lot of these companies are enormous, and they have basically, they're not maybe technically a monopoly, but there's 3 or 4 companies that control over 60% of a market, and it's a de facto kind of monopoly or oligopoly, and they all coordinate maybe informally. But we have antitrust laws in the United States, and they should be applied to these companies, and they should be broken up. They control so much. So those are 2 big pieces. And then in terms of accessing land, there are a couple different ideas that people have, but in general, it requires an enormous amount of capital to acquire farmland, and it's very hard to make a living as a farmer. Margins are very slim, and there just have to be public funds available to ensure that especially young people, young farmers, new and beginning farmers, farmers of color, can access that land for the next generation.
Thank you so much, Tristan. Very, very quickly, because we do have a couple more questions that I would like to get to. Emmanuel, Laura, is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, if I might just jump in to mention that I wouldn't say in Brazil our work is focused in supporting communities and smallholder farmers to have access to public policy. So, but not only that, like we also want to push for an agroecological transition as well. So our work has been supporting that. And also there are some public policies, but also markets that in order for those smallholder farmers to access, they need to, it's very hard for them to access alone. So we really support them to join in cooperatives and build stronger movements to strengthen their capacity to access markets or public policies, because we do believe that that's in our theory of change has to do with climate justice, and also is a way of securing them. I mean, it's not only to give them the tenure security that will allow them to succeed. So being able to succeed economically is also part of this. So our work goes through that direction in a way.
Thank you so much. Laura, very quickly, is there anything from you?
I would like to go to the question that Ana Carolina typed down. So yes, in my presentation, I talked about how peasant families and indigenous communities are producing the food that we are right now eating in the cities and in the towns. But I didn't mention that they are also the ones who are keeping the woods and the water sources. So I think this, as a society, we must recognize this role in the of these communities and support them. There has been the government has denied this role for over and over years. There are no public policies that support this role, so important and so important in this moment to stop the climate change. On the other hand, the government, whenever it comes to these communities, the policy has been the only support they have given out to the indigenous communities and the peasant families is fertilizers, chemical fertilizers. So we are doing, as ActionAid, we work with the alliance of different peasants organizations, and we are proposing integral development program to be carried out in this COVID and post-COVID context in order to strengthen this small scale production and to take advantage of this knowledge of communities that is very useful to face the climate change. On the other hand, we are clear that the enterprises, the very big monocultures, are the ones that are disturbing the ecosystems in these parts of the country. So I think that the peasant movement is in capacity of bringing in alternatives to the current model of rural development. It's about a political issue to be heard, the peasant movement to be heard, and to the state to take in their proposals.
Thank you so much. And certainly one of my reflections to that question is preserving our forest land is one of the best ways for us to take the land sector into account in addressing climate change, both from a mitigation standpoint, but also from an adaptation standpoint. And there's more and more research that is showing that securing land rights of indigenous communities who have been preserving these lands for centuries is a much better strategy than centralized government control or other strategies that have been put out there. So there is increasing awareness of that, which we're hoping will get traction. All right, we're gonna take one last question from Alan Coulter. We're gonna unmute you, very quick to ask your question.
Thank you for the presentation. Are there US NGOs that are doing strong work to help protect indigenous rights in Guatemala or Brazil?
Thank you, Alan. Would like to take that very quickly. I'm gravitating toward Tristan, but yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say, even though I would say ActionAid USA first, since we're working with our partners in Brazil and Guatemala on that. But there are a number of other organizations that are engaged in these issues as well that we work with in the United States. I mean, one partner, for example, in the U.S. that focuses a lot on the Amazon is Amazon Watch. They're based in the U.S. I think they also have people in Brazil, and there are other organizations in the U.S. That give visibility to the issues. But I think it's important that organizations, I mean, ActionAid Brazil and ActionAid Guatemala are doing amazing work in both of those countries, and they're connected to folks in the U.S. through this ActionAid Federation, but are staffed with people from the countries. So I'm not sure if Emmanuel or Laura have other thoughts about other organizations from the U.S. that you might work with.
I was gonna say the Amazon Watch was an obvious one, but they focus their work in the Amazon. So I have a couple of names from international organizations that have offices in the US, but not necessarily US based, like FIAN. We have a few people from FIAN that are on the webinar. What else? We have a few religious based organizations that also work in very strongly in protecting communities' rights. Yeah, those are the names that first come to my mind.
Yes, on my side, I can think of international NGOs that have also their chapter in the US. And we have done a joint work with them. For example, we did a campaign against the before corporations, food corporations, transnational corporations, to stop buying palm oil producers in Guatemala. And that's why Cargill, Lever, and Nestlé stopped buying palm oil from a specific enterprise in Guatemala that was violating rights. And this is a joint work we have done with some NGOs in the United States and international NGOs as well that have their work. Right now, I cannot name specific US NGOs, perhaps the Jewish Service, World Service Association is one of the ones we work with also, defending Indigenous rights in the country. And I will say that the murder of this French colleague that I mentioned before, he was working for agronomists and veterinarians without frontier. And this is we feel this was a message to all of the NGOs that are supporting Indigenous people to defend their common rights. So I think we have to build a big alliance in order to stop this occurring in Guatemala.
Thank you so much to all our speakers. We are going to move very quickly to a small collective exercise that we wanted to do to keep this interactive and give those of you who are attending a chance to share some of your thoughts as well. We're going to go a little bit past 3:30, just a few minutes, so we can round out this exercise. And we call it a 15% solution exercise. The reason is that, so when we think about these big issues, they feel like huge issues that are very difficult to tackle, and it can often leave us feeling powerless. And what we would like to do is to get past that a bit and think about some of the small steps that each of us as individuals can do. It could be volunteering in your community. It could be signing a petition to local lawmakers. It could be supporting an organization whose mission you really believe in through a small donation of some kind. It could be having a conversation with your neighbor who you know doesn't agree with you or doesn't see why these issues are problems. They could be small steps. And you might have, if you think of your capacity as from 0% doing absolutely nothing to 100% where you do 5 or 6 different things. Start small. Start with, if you could just use 15% of the capacity that you think you have to make some change or to do some step, what would that be? And what we'd like to do, as you think about this, Jenna is posting in the chat a link to a Slido, which will allow us to generate a word cloud. And what we'd like you to do is to just think about, if you could just use 15% of your capacity to do something, what would that be? Type in a word or a phrase. I think you can type in more than one. Just go ahead and type it, and we'll generate a word cloud and see what ideas people have. I threw out a few, but you all may have other ideas for ways in which you can show up and fight back against the oppression that we've been talking about. I'll give us a couple minutes for folks to think and write up ideas. This is great. There's some really great ideas in here. I should say, donate is the biggest thing that seems to be on this page, and I'll take that opportunity to just say that that your support through donations, whether they're one-off donations or a monthly sustaining membership, are absolutely crucial to the kind of work that we do. So I would encourage you to continue to donate to us or to organizations that you believe in, because it's your donations that really enable us to keep doing the work that we do. But also, I see things here about sharing about the issue on social media and the like, and I encourage you to share the sort of the webinars that groups that you are interested in are doing, share the things that they're posting about the work they're doing. All those things are really valuable in building visibility and presence about these issues. This is great. Support local farms. I love that. That's great. Fabulous. All right. Well, we're at 3:30, so I am going to wrap us up. I want to start by thanking our organizers, and they are the core people who have been involved internally are Jenna, Rachel, Ehab, Doug, and Sophia. And a special shout out to Annabelle Membrillo from Resilience Initiative, who helped us think through this webinar and how best to structure it and facilitate it. Thank you to our speakers, to Laura, Emmanuel, and to Tristan. You did such a great job sharing your experience and being so generous with your time. We really appreciate it. And thank you to all of you who joined and participated and spent this time with us. We will be following up with you with the survey, and I think Jenna will also drop this in the link, because we'd love to know your thoughts about how this went. It'll take less than 5 minutes. We're so grateful to you for coming along with us on this journey. And because we've got 2 more webinars lined up, we really, really want to get your feedback so we can improve for the next time around. And with that, I will say just one last thank you all around. I hope you stay connected. I hope you take action in whatever way that you see fit, and stay tuned for webinar number 2. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Niranjali. Thanks, everyone.